Yeah, we can hear you. You sound great.
Now we can't.
Hold on. There we
Now
go.
we
There you
can.
are.
I didn't know if I was going to know how to work this thing, so I just joined to make sure I didn't screw this whole thing up.
There's the Uncle
Well, we're
Boojies
glad
man
to-
right there.
So
well,
where's everybody from? All over the country or?
Pretty much all
Yeah.
over the country here.
Danville, Kentucky.
Okay. My kids went to Center College, great little town.
I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but I was
Okay.
in Jeffersonville, Indiana before.
Okay.
Bellbrook, Ohio.
Go ahead, Harold and
I'm
Ashley.
from northern Indiana, but I'm in Florida now.
I
Okay.
wish I was with you.
Yeah. We're down in
It's really
Vance,
nice
Alabama,
here.
which is right out of Tuscaloosa. So don't hold that as against us.
I have to. I'm from Georgia.
Give you a roll tide then.
No. Go dogs.
Bruce, where are you from?
Bellbrook, Ohio. It's
Just
closer
right
to
after
Dayton
Chris.
than Cincinnati, but kind of in between.
And Bruce?
I live in Louisville.
Louisville for Bruce. What about you, Bill?
Kansas City.
Kansas City. Joe Tucker?
North Carolina.
Not in your airplane hangar.
Travis? I know. He didn't want to.
We're in Nashville.
Nashville. And Gerald?
I'm in Florida, Panama City.
There you go. Justin Haverstock, where are you from?
So I'm from Auburn, Indiana, but I'm out on work in Salem, Alabama right now, calling from the hotel.
How close is that to you, Harold?
Salem? Not sure.
Yeah,
Shoot.
right, probably an hour from Mobile.
Oh,
Yeah,
Oh,
then
he's
you're
closer
3
to
hours.
me.
Meet him up.
Yeah, he's closer to me in Georgia than he
Oh,
is to
3
you
hours.
guys in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah. Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Did I miss anybody? Sandy's in Taylorsville, Kentucky. And I think that's everyone. So
I'm originally from Northern Virginia for 55 years, but I'm in Florida for
Barrett.
2 years. So Florida for 2.5 years, Northern Virginia for 55 years.
Wow.
I grew
So
up
there
in
you go,
Vermont.
Steve. We're from all over.
That's
I grew
awesome.
up in Vermont, but I've been in Ohio for 44 years.
Wow. So Ben, you told me the story. How did and I know Steve pretty well. I've known him for about 30 years. I mean, how did everybody come to find your site and what you're doing?
Well, that's an interesting thing. A lot of it was word of mouth. And early on, it was the TikTok
Okay.
Bourbon reviews on TikTok.
channel.
Yeah.
60. And he parlayed it into this club, and it brought in a lot of people initially, and over 6,000 members of the Big Bourbon Club. And right now we are changing hands, and there's going to be some information coming out on that, so you guys all get a little preview. Steve realized he can't do it by himself, and it was a one-man band or a one-man show for a long time. And so what he's done is turned it over to an LLC that he has handpicked of active members, and we're all working together to make sure that this thing stays together and we maintain fun events and have great things happening with the club that benefit our members. And then it's all about community. A lot of the clubs out there are one of two things. They're a bottle buy program where you do a subscription or whatever else, or the other thing they are an homage to some local celebrity, one guy that's the celebrity of the group, and everybody kind of watches him do his lives. That's not this club. This club's unique because it's a community, and there's not a lot like us that are this size. And so we can do a lot of great things just by everybody being involved and everybody contributing. We can deliver a great program for the members. So that's what Big Bourbon Club is becoming or is all about. And I know that was Steve's vision from the beginning.
Well, I appreciate everybody's time. I didn't sleep well last night, so I'm going to try to stay awake, and I'm not real great on technology, but I was able to put this guy. This is the general store, and this gentleman was my grandfather, and Uncle Boojies was actually his brother. This is the general store that I visited when I was a child in a little town called New Haven, Kentucky. And the store that it was just the most magical place on the planet for, I grew up in the city and went to the country, and so this is Paul Howard. Like I said, he's my mother was one of 11 children. I'm one of 33 cousins. And this was the most gentle man that I'd ever known. I think that the thing that I can describe to you the most is he lived in a little town. He ran the general store, about 1,000 people, and he was the first man I ever watched take his last breath. But more importantly, several days later, there's a small church in this town, and it probably seats 200 or 300 people, and 1,500 people showed up to this man's funeral after he was in his 80s. So the thing that I learned, really after my mother died, I was sitting around talking to my uncles, and nobody ever wants to talk about the things that your family members have done wrong. And I discovered that I was born, from a Kentucky, as I gently call them, a Kentucky crime family. That my family moved into Kentucky, and after the Revolutionary War, a gentleman by the name of Edward Howard. And there's an old saying: when the English arrived in the New World, they build a church. When the Dutch arrived, they build a barn. But by God, when the Scotch Irish show up, we set up our still. And so we've been making illegal whiskey in Kentucky for well over 200 years. And this put me on a 20-year journey to discover my mother's family and the past of our family. They settled in a town called Howardstown, which is still there. There's 10 or 15 people that live there today. Still a beautiful little church and a cemetery with most of the Howard relatives. And so they built Howardstown, and Howardstown was along in the Rolling Fork River Valley. And so, if you study early bourbon history in Kentucky, the Rolling Fork River Valley is one of the seed beds of bourbon making, production. Lots of beautiful, limestone springs feed into the Rolling Fork River, which eventually leads into the Ohio River. But most of all, it was remote and hard to get to. And it became this community where everybody, after a few generations, was related. And that really became their Iron Curtain. The sheriffs were cousins. Like I said, I've got 32 first cousins. And, by the time you mix these big Catholic families, it doesn't take long to where everybody is a cousin and nobody's going to rat them out. So, John McDougall Atherton, I don't know if you've heard of the Atherton distilleries, but I'd like to talk about, post-Civil War was really when this underground supply of whiskey making took place in America, or at least in Kentucky. There was by 1865, we've got a $2 tax on spirits in America. Now, whiskey is selling in Kentucky for about, from what my research has found, about 45 cents a gallon. And so you can imagine when, whiskey goes, or bourbon goes, from 45 cents a gallon to $2.45 a gallon, the opportunity for the folks in the hills who've been making whiskey out back to start selling and making a lot of whiskey goes through the roof. I mean, if you sell for $1.50 a gallon, you're making a fortune, especially the poor farmers that existed in Nelson County at that time. And so, by 1890, the state of Kentucky starts passing local option laws, and we start voting ourselves dry. So most people want to talk about Most people want to talk about Prohibition, in 1918, in the early 1920s, but really by 1891, and by the time we get to Prohibition, 80% of Kentucky counties are dry. There's only 13 counties that are wet. And of course, every time one of these counties votes itself dry, the price of corn whiskey or bourbon whiskey goes through the roof. And we have documented, I was fortunate to inherit a manuscript and some old cassette tapes of the folks that ran the operations in Howardstown during Prohibition. In 1924, white whiskey coming out of the still is selling for $30 a gallon, which is extraordinary. The multiplier, uh, if you adjust for inflation, is about 20 times. So we're somewhere around $500 or $600 a gallon in 1924. Now, why is that? The folks in Kentucky knew how to make good whiskey. And, there's lots of stories out there where people all over the country started thinking that they could make whiskey. And of course, if you don't take the heads and the tails off properly, they're trying to make whiskey with radiators. So you've got lead leaching into it. People are trying to distill rubbing alcohol, which the government added benzene and other poisons to it. So, the idea of Jake leg and causing blindness, the estimates that I can find online is somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people died during Prohibition from drinking bad whiskey. So one of my distant cousins, a guy named Mr. Jesse Spalding, was in partnership with John McDougall Atherton. So the reason I bring up the Atherton story, by 1880, 1885, early, maybe 1890, John McDougall Atherton is the largest bourbon whiskey distiller in the nation. He's producing about 20% of the nation's whiskey in a little town called Athertonville, which is about 3 miles, 4 miles downriver from Howardstown, in between New Haven and also where Waddy Boone originally set up his still. So this is a mecca for bourbon whiskey making. My family's making illegal whiskey, and Atherton is making legal whiskey. He sells out in 1899 and moves to Louisville and starts getting in the real estate business and builds a famous hotel. For those of you who've been to Louisville, the Sealback Hotel was his. He was the financier. And the Sealback is, the number one hotel in the Midwest. It has rivals in Chicago, but, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Nashville were all much smaller than Louisville, Kentucky at this point. And Louisville was, in the early 1900s, the turn of the 20th century, was super rich. I mean, gilded age rich because of tobacco, because of the river, because of whiskey. It had all this money flowing into it. And John McDougall Atherton became one of the richest guys in the Midwest. He was on the board of the L&N Railroad, which everything that moved south of the Mason-Dixon line for decades moved on the L&N Railroad. People, goods, and so they really had a steel grip on transportation, production, whiskey, and so John McDougall Atherton and the Sealback becomes the connection for Howardstown to the mobs of Chicago and St. Louis. And actually, we have documentation from Uncle Boojies himself, where they sold to Capone's folks. We've actually got a documented trip to Chicago, and other stuff, and so they are running, again, this manuscript and these interviews. They're running 400 gallons a day to Louisville for distribution. And if you do the math and you adjust for inflation, it's $50 million a year in this little tiny town of 20 families in the hills along the Rolling Fork River Valley that went on for a decade. It's the most extraordinary story. And so I was fortunate enough to get the family mash bills. There's a couple of them. There's a rye and there's a bourbon. There's a couple bourbons. And so if you come to Kentucky, I know people are everywhere, but I'd like to give out a code where people can, we're going to do this event on, I think it's Saturday, right? Am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and we'll send out I'd like to send out a code or because if people want to travel to Louisville, so that they get the same benefit, we can make it good for the rest of the year. Um, and so we've got, on the floor, everything is uncut and unfiltered. We celebrate the single barrel, and you're going to taste 4 barrels. There's 2 single barrel bourbons. There's their family's rye recipe, and then we've got a double oaked that's on the floor. And then we are coming out with this Prohibition mash sometime next year. We're not tasting that right now. I've only got about 5 or 6 barrels of that, and it's, that's the hard part about this whole thing is, you don't want to build 100 barrels of stuff that's going to taste like, excuse my language, shit in 5, 6, 7 years. But all the barrels on the floor today are 8 and 9 years old, and so the process is you taste the barrels, and if you like the barrel, we're going to hand you a bottle and a whiskey thief, and we're going to fill it right there. So, every bottle at Uncle Boojies is a one of one. The barrels are going to change tomorrow. The flavor is going to change. And so we want to celebrate the small maker. We've only been, we're only available at Uncle Boojies. We're not in the 3-tier distribution system. It makes our bourbon rare, and we want to be the bottle on your bar that nobody else has. And quite honestly, I'm not sure the 3-tier system works financially for the industry anymore. For the small guys, that you just get crushed. So you can always get a good friend. There's probably a few of them that live in Louisville that can help you get a bottle and ship it to you. But the real story here is the gentleman behind me, um, who's we call him Daddy Howard. And he was by far the greatest man I've ever known. And so this is my retirement. I've been putting away bourbon for about a decade. We think it's spectacular. I think you will agree if you come visit us. And we're here to make friends. So happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I got a couple questions for you, Steve. One is, so if you talked about them moonshining, and forgive me for my lack of knowledge here. It sounds like you're an expert in the field. When they moonshine and they turned it into bourbon, it's easy to hide a still per se, but what about barrels, and how did that work during the time that they were shining and hiding?
Yeah, so a couple things. When I started this journey, I was told by my uncle, he goes, "Don't ever use the word moonshine." It was a very derogatory word. It's a great book. What's this guy's name? Bruce Stewart, and he talks about the bootlegging and illegal whiskey trade in North Carolina. You can look it up. It is called moonshiners, but the whole word moonshine was designed to make fun of these people, and so that was one word we don't really use. But there were 18 illegal stills operating in different hollers in along the Rolling Fork River, and that's just in Howardstown. I mean, there are literally, you know, there. So we've got documentation right after the Civil War in 1865, where a Sheriff Merriweather goes into Howardstown to try to shut down the illegal operation and collect the taxes, and um, and we have a bulletin, of a military bulletin that documents that he ran up against a resistance of 300 to 400 armed men. Um, so, in 1924-25, the average wage in and I'm going to get back to your question here, but it's just extraordinary. The average wage in rural Kentucky is about $10 a month, and they're paying $25 a day to work in the stills. So you can understand, I mean, these are uneducated. I kindly refer to them as hillbilly gangsters, right? And so there wasn't a lot of storage going on. I mean, they're making bourbon, and they're storing it in attics, they're storing it in barns. There's one guy named Frank Boone who builds a house and we have I could show you we've got the newspaper article, but it's an 8-room house. It's actually sitting right on the road, and it looks like, you know, a regular house, and the whole house is a distillery. And so they would, you know, in the middle of the night, they would make their whiskey. Now, everybody wants to think in these big 53-gallon barrels. You've got to understand that you're hauling whiskey out of the hills. And so in the manuscript that we have, they're using 10-gallon kegs because, you know, they got to move them quickly. And you know, nobody's got bottles. I mean, they're not messing around with moonshine jugs. They're not messing around with, so they're trying to sell you a 10-gallon keg of whiskey because they want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And so they would put it up in the attic. And, you know, if you age in a 10-gallon keg of whiskey, you actually age faster because you've got more surface area per gallon of whiskey. And so they put it up in their attic. And of course, red whiskey was a lot more valuable than white whiskey. But, you know, nobody was really aging bourbon back then. I mean, again, they're after the money. Certain people are putting it away. I mean, I inherited some 15-year-old barrels. We've got a few of, you know, those few bottles of that left. But, you know, nobody really, it's a trend, you know, they're there to make money. They're starving. There's nothing to do in these hills except make whiskey. And, you know, the corn crop, if you look at also post-Civil War, and you can go on AI and talk about that. In the 1870s, as we start opening up all the lands of the Louisiana Purchase, everybody in Illinois and you know, the plains start planting corn. Well, corn goes down to nothing, right? And so you can you, you know, you could plant a whole year's worth of corn and make $50. Well, you could turn it into corn whiskey and make $5,000. And so, you know, it was strictly an economic issue. And so the answer to your question is little 10-gallon kegs. We're going to move them as fast as we can. You know, we're making during Prohibition, 18 illegal stills operating 7 days a week, 300 to 400 men. It is a machine, and we actually have documented the cars that they used to haul the whiskey. They would travel in pairs because of hijackers. Everybody was, you know, loaded up with guns, and they would do 2 trips a day with 2 cars and transport just under 200 gallons per trip.
Wow.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. It's never been told.
So a lot of what they were drinking then would be what we would call new make.
Yeah, it would be, you know, legally it's called white distillate. Lots of people call it white dog. All, you know, straight out of the still. Interestingly enough, when they did put it in jars, when they always sold the jars. Archie Spalding, who again is a distant cousin, you know, they would bead the whiskey with their eye back then, and he could tell exactly when a jar of whiskey was 105 proof. And that was how they always sold their whiskey. He said that was the proper proof for drinking whiskey or drinking bourbon. It's a lot of fun.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So tell us a little bit about Uncle Boogie. So you named it after your great uncle, right?
Yeah, you know, when we were looking at the name, you know, Paul Howard's bourbon whiskey doesn't sound like a lot of fun. Boojie was quite a character. You know, Daddy Howard was the guy who worked all the time, and Boojie, his brother, there were 5 boys and 1 girl. And Boojie was the character of the county, if you will. Always having a lot of fun, always driving too fast, you know, bootlegging and trading. I'm not sure he ever had a job except for trading whiskey. And Boojie, there's lots of stories. Boojie had a glass eye. He was in a fight when he was a teenager, and a guy kicked him in the head with his boot. And so I remember as a little kid, you'd go in his house and he had this big chair, and right next to the chair was a bowl of glass eyes, and they were all different colors. So, he'd take an eye and pop it in his mouth and then put it in, and one day he'd have a green, a blue eye. I mean, he was just always having fun. I heard a story the other day. Somebody came in, a new Boojie, um, and he always carried around this big wallet full of cash. Nobody had credit cards back then. Nobody trusts the banks. They're selling. I mean, can you imagine trying to hide $50 million a year in cash somewhere? I mean, who the hell knows where you put it? But and so Bucci had this big wallet, and he went to the dentist one day, and he's going around, and the dentist goes, "Take that damn wallet, sit it on the table." So he takes the wallet, sets it on the table, and he pops out his eye and he sets it right next to it. He goes, "I'm just going to make sure we keep an eye on that," right? So um, he was always a clown. I heard a story where he left an eye at the still, so he keep an eye whether the revenues were coming out. I mean, that's part of the fun. Is now everybody. I'm meeting some gentleman next to in 2 weeks who knew Boojie, and said guy walked into a bar, and with an automatic weapon after I don't know, I guess back during the 70s in Vietnam, and Boojie took a baseball bat and beat the shit out of him and saved everybody's life in the whole place. So it's been a lot of fun hearing all the old stories, and as a kid nobody's going to tell you any of this, right? So it's been quite enjoyable.
Sounds like he's larger than life for sure. What would you say if there was any like Boojieism that you kind of tried to maintain or put into your business today? What would you say it is?
Well, we're here to have fun, right? Again, we're not in the 3-tier system. You know, you, and our plan is to make 200 barrels a year, and that's it. Since we're keeping all the margin, we don't need to be big. We don't need to be, we want you to have fun. We want you to come. We want to hear your family stories. Um, we want and we think I mean, we have people come in all the time saying it's the best whiskey they've ever had. I mean, when you start putting whiskey in bottles for national distribution, you give up so many things. You give up the char that's going to end up in your barrel. You give up, lots of flavor. People are cold filtering it. You're blending all these different barrels together to get something that can go out and be sold in national distribution. And we think the only way that we can survive is by being unique and different. And so really, every bottle is one of a kind. But no, we want you to come visit us. We want, you to tell us your stories. We want you to become part of our story. Um, one of the greatest things that I can remember is going to my grandmother's house for Christmas. And, at my Christmas, when I was a kid, there's 100 people there, right? And everybody's bringing big dishes. I mean, we always cooked, we didn't cook for 3 and 4. We cooked in quantities of 10 and 20 and 40 and 60. You didn't make one thing of dressing, you made 6. And everybody had their own special recipe. And my mother always had the dressing, and somebody would have the yams. And so, again, this store is, when I was a child, was the most amazing, magical place. To my right was a little penny candy place, and I didn't see my grandfather but 4 or 5 times a year. But every time I walked in the door, he'd have this big smile on his face, and he'd take out this paper sack, and I'd climb up on this little wooden ladder and just handfuls of penny candy. He was the most gentle, kindest person you'd ever meet. And I didn't understand until after my mother died that, he was a crime boss. It's just so hilarious, right? I mean, these guys made lots of money, and they dealt with some of the roughest characters in the country. And it went on into the 40s and 50s. You can look up a guy named Big Six Henderson, who was a legendary marshal in Kentucky, and he retired in the 70s. And he proudly claims that he chased the boys in Howardstown for 40 and 50 years. So really, it wasn't until, and there's a movie coming out, another Johnny Boone, who also came out of Howardstown, I don't know if you've ever heard the story of the Cornbread Mafia, but Johnny Boone, when these boys got back from Vietnam, they all moved to marijuana, and Johnny Boone out of Howardstown became the largest marijuana grower in the nation. And so there's a great book by a friend of mine. And Johnny is also, a descendant of Waddy Boone and a distant relative of mine. But it's just a great place, and I want to make Howardstown the most famous little town that nobody's ever heard of.
Awesome.
So are you going to do anything in Howardstown, or everything's going to be in Paris-town, or?
It's hard to get people. Howardstown's in the middle of nowhere. There's the gentleman built the log still distillery out in New Haven, and he's having a really rough time getting people to come. So we've got a little 4,000 square foot building in Louisville in Paris-town. And you've been there. It's we've got a wood burning fireplace. We've got we'll have music out back, bluegrass music. We really just celebrate the soul of Kentucky.
Amazing.
Awesome. Tell me about the Great Pour Out of 1930. So when I was doing some research on you and everything, ran across this story. So tell us about that.
Well, it was a cold winter's day. I think it was January. And so Mr. Jesse ran the gambling and bootleg operations out of the Silback Hotel in Louisville. And he went there 3 or 4 days a week. And then Archie and my family, Archie Spalding was his son. And then the Howards, Boojie's grandfather, and Chester and Boojie, Boojie was a little kid during Prohibition. But everybody played, everybody was in the bootlegging business. And so there was a town, they didn't hide this stuff much, right? Right across from the store is a house, and it's filled with whiskey. I mean, just absolutely filled with whiskey. Now, normally, these people were smart and rich, and so they ran a telephone. They created their own telephone company in the early 1900s and ran a line down the Rolling Fork River to Athertonville, then to New Haven, then to Culvertown and into Barchtown, which connected them to Louisville. And they were bribing the main federal guy in Louisville $3,000 a month. Right now, you do the math. That's $700,000 a
That's
year in
huge.
today's money. And so, but somebody got pissed off, and so Mr. Jesse was called to Louisville that day. And they raided the town. And Archie Spalding's brother was going to go to jail for 5 years, and Archie said it was his stuff, and he ended up in federal prison down in Georgia for 2 years. But normally when you hear that the feds are coming, and my grandfather and Boojie had a house in Line Station, which is a few miles away. This is 20 years later. When you hear the feds are coming, you set the house on fire, and because the only way to get rid of the evidence, because if they catch you with the booze, then they take your farm and they take everything on it, right? Um, People want to. It is extraordinary. And I'm off topic here a little bit. So the Great Pour Out, to finish up that story, that day they poured out, within 2 days, they poured out 4,000 gallons of, in the middle of town out of this house. So they were bringing it in the attic, unload. The entire house was filled with liquor. And, if you do the math on it, it was, I think I haven't done this in a while, but probably in today's money is about $1 million worth of whiskey. And it was just, and everybody's there. I tell the story, the nun in the church gets all the kids and they come out and watch it, and people are drunk as fish. The store, everybody's rushing into the store and buying every jar and bucket and everything else. People are laying in the alleys, in the gutter and drinking up. I mean, it's just I hopefully I'm going to get my book published next fall. And I tell the story of this day. It's been documented several times, and Boojie tells the story. We have him on videotape, but it was just the craziest thing you've ever seen. There was so much whiskey that rolled into the Rolling Fork River, it killed the fish, right? I mean,
Wow.
everybody and everything was drunk. And it was a big, big day. But as Archie said, they only got about a fifth of what we had on hand that day. And so the rest of it was scattered in the hills and in different places. But I want to go back to these raids. I want to go back a little bit to post-Civil War. If you're living in the mountains of eastern Kentucky or Georgia, Tennessee, up into West Virginia, um, you've got a land grant. Your grandfather was a Revolutionary War hero. You got a few hundred acres for his service. It'd been passed down from generation to generation, and every little community had a distiller. And Bruce Stewart goes through this in detail in his book. It's definitely worth your read if you're interested in the history of all this. And so one day, you're the local guy in town that's making whiskey. And the other thing is everybody, we don't talk about our mash bill because where I come from, if you learn the family secrets, we got to cut you up and feed you the hogs. But um, everybody's got all these complicated mash bills and everything else. I mean, you basically made whiskey with what was out back. If you're making whiskey in 1785, you're making corn whiskey because corn is what is being grown in Kentucky, right? And we talk about the Corn Patch and Cabin Rights Act, where you can come to Kentucky. Thomas Jefferson is the governor of Virginia. You can come to Kentucky before, 17, I guess 80. I don't remember 17. Get this right because I think he's 1779 is when Thomas Jefferson is the governor of Virginia. I mean, during the Revolutionary War, they're trying to settle Virginia. It's such a crazy thing to me. Um, so, anyways, you got your land, you fought your wars, you've been living on your land in peace, and nobody really cared about anybody in the Appalachian Mountains. Um, and so this movement to which was pushed by the Methodist, and the Southern Baptist movement, right? The movement of temperance starts, with Carrie Nation and that whole group. And in the beginning, nobody really gave a shit until the industrialists of New York got involved. And they went to Appalachia, and Bruce, again, talks about this a lot in his book. They saw the old growth forest, they saw the minerals, they saw the mines, and they're like, well, these people are poor, dumb, and stupid. We must go save them now, right? And the way they saved them is they sent sheriffs in to bust up their stills, and they would take your land from you. And then they would haul you off to Louisville to a federal courthouse. So when you were supposed to pay the taxes, you're supposed to pay the taxes in cash at the federal courthouse. Well, I can guarantee you people living in the 1880s and 1870s in Eastern Kentucky have never been to a federal courthouse. I mean, you're living on a little farm. Most people never go more than 5-10 miles away from home, right? And there was also no hard currency in the mountains. So whiskey was the currency. You could buy anything with a keg of whiskey. And so this whole idea of taking money and bringing it to the federal courthouse was all phony. It was just all bullshit. So they'll come in and take your farm. They'll leave your wife and your children homeless. And then the social workers come in and they tell your wife that you're now an unfit mother because you don't have a way to take care of your children. And they take your children away from you and move them into orphanages hundreds of miles away to beat the mountains out of these people, right? They wanted to beat the mountains out of these children. It was a complete massacre. Um, and that's why the people in the mountains, and you go out to, where my family's from, they don't like outsiders. They don't trust outsiders. They don't want you there. Who are you to sanction their life and tell them how to live? And, I always tease my friends, hopefully I still got a pass because, these guys can shoot you from 3 miles away, right? I mean, they all got the guns and everything else, but it's an amazing story. I hope you will do an in-depth dive into how these people were treated because, and that's the whole thing, right? So we're paying off the feds, we're paying off the sheriffs, we're paying off the law. Who's the crook here? Is it the guy
Right.
making the whiskey, or is it the guy accepting the bribe, or is it the judge getting the bribe? I mean, who's the crook, right? Well, I can guarantee you the sheriffs and the judges and the feds, they never lost their farms, they never lost their families. Um, and that's the kind of story and the story that we want to keep alive with Uncle Boojies.
Will that be in your book? Will we get a taste of that?
It will be.
history?
All of it's in my book. And I'm doing some short stories that you can find online as kind of a, they're on our website, which you can read and download. The book is pretty much finished. And this story is amazing. I mean, Edward Howard came to America, Scotch Irish, somewhere around 1745, fought under George Washington in the Battle of Monongahela. Uh, Abraham Lincoln lived right down, actually, Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, worked at the Athertonville distillery. I mean, it's all these people that, created this great nation that interacted with my family. It's just fascinating, how it's happened over 6, 7 generations.
Well, when you get that book published and it's ready for sale, make sure you get me a link and
We will.
we'll send it out to the members so they can order it.
Thank you.
Couple other questions for you. I was told to ask you about the stoneware jugs that you're doing.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Yeah.
Well, so when everybody comes to Louisville, there's a great, what I call a great American treasure, which I am the steward of as well. And it's the last standing great American stoneware factory. It was founded in 1815 on the banks of the Ohio River. And so in our first offerings, these 15-year-old barrels that I inherited from one of my uncles, we actually put them in the stoneware jugs. And, there's a few of those left. We are probably looking at in the future, before George Garvin Brown, I think George Garvin Brown put bourbon, I might get this date wrong, in 1870 in a bottle. And Owsley Brown, who used to be the chairman of Brown Forman, was a great friend of mine. And he always talked about the unscrupulous competitor. Owsley was this buttoned up, always wore these beautiful British suits, and he was the greatest storyteller ever. But he would talk about the unscrupulous competitor would pour all kinds of stuff in the keg. Back then in my grandfather's general store, there was a keg of whiskey and the stoneware jugs were growlers. And so, but the problem was, people poured all kinds of stuff in these barrels, to make them darker. They were constantly screwing with it. If you put an iron nail in a 53-gallon keg of whiskey, it turns to soup and ruins in about 3 days. So George Garvin Brown was the first guy to put it in a bottle at the distillery and protect the quality of his product, and therefore the stoneware jugs went away. But we still produce some today, and we're working on a program where we're hopefully going to have some that you can buy as growlers so that you can, we really had to go to the bottle because the manufacturing cost of the jugs was just way too expensive. I mean, we had $25 in packaging. It's just crazy. But as a growler, it's a lot of fun. You can take the bottle and pour it in the growler and tell the story of Uncle Boojies. So we're working on that for next year as well.
I think that's great. Couple of fun questions for you before we turn it over to the audience to ask you whatever they want to ask you. So if you were stuck in a card game at the Seal Bach with Al Capone and Jesse Spalding, which of your current barrels would you bring to the table to ensure you walked away a winner?
Well, I have to tell you that this Prohibition
Uh-oh.
rye, or
He's
this,
thinking.
it's not a rye, this Prohibition bourbon has a unique twist, and it's not available yet. And again, it's just now turning 5. And it is, I think, the most extraordinary whiskey I've ever made. We started putting whiskey away about a decade ago, and I think our stuff tastes great. But this new recipe, um, and it was given to me by my uncle who got it from his great grandfather, is extraordinary. And I think it, at 5 years old, I think it drinks, I always tease people. I let them taste it and I ask them how old it is. And I normally get 9, 10 years old. There's only one person that's looked at the barrel it's in and goes, well, that barrel's not very old. So it's not that old. But anyways, so it just gave away the trick. But if you come in and ask me about it, I'll get you a quick little nip of it. But I think it's going to be just spectacular.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So what would you say, Steve, is the most unbougie thing somebody could do to a glass of bourbon?
Mix it with Coke. And so I am, listen, there's lots of bourbons out there that you can mix with, lots of drinks, and we make a beautiful old fashioned. We've got fun cocktails. And Dante, our one of our managers, is an award-winning, bartender. He's won awards all over the country. He's created all these beautiful cocktails. But if you're drinking great whiskey, I think it belongs neat or on a big rock.
I like that. I agree with you 100%. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our audience 5 minutes early. Thank you so much. What a great story. I'm so excited to see your distillery and find out more about you guys and what you're doing and really taste that Prohibition, if you let me. But if you want to unmute your lines, we'll go ahead and let the audience ask some questions. Yeah, take note of that, Steve. Have one ready.
I will. We're going to do it in the back room, though. We're not going to share it with everybody.
All right. Before anybody speaks up, the one question that was in the audience was about your distilling process. You're distilling your own. Are you doing that at the Howardstown location?
Well, we've been using, we've been using Whiskey Thief as our distilling partner. So we've been pot distilling up at Whiskey Thief.
Fantastic.
Yeah, when you come, you're going to come to our home place. It is a DSP. We've got a small distillery on site. There's a lot of people that I think are going to be in trouble who built all this manufacturing capacity. And they're in the 3-tier system, and there's just not enough margin to survive anymore. I know of 2 or 3 brands that'll probably go under in the next 6, 7 months because they're offering us, barrels really, really cheap, right? And inventory and parts and pieces and everything else. So we use our, we're very careful. We have our very specific requirements on our mash bills, on the quality of the grain and everything else. But for right now, we're using somebody else to make our whiskey. And what
That's
I'm working
okay.
on,
You just got the whole Big Bourbon Club excited because Whiskey Thief is a really good friend of the Big Bourbon Club.
yeah, and Walter's a great friend, and we started out with Ross before Walter, and they do things right. We're probably looking at, and we're designing right now, uh, probably a 300-gallon pot still. I want to do a program where you can come in with your friends and we'll set the mash and we'll do the cook. And then we have a big party out back, with you and your friends, and we'll, do the final distilling. And then you can walk out with enough White Dog and a 25-gallon Kelvin barrel to take the barrel home and age it yourself. And that's where kind of the growlers would come in. If let's say you get 15 or 20 people to do it with you, everybody gets a growler, and then you start aging, hopefully you come back every year. And It's a less expensive way to get into a barrel program for your, your state groups. And so legally I can, sell you a 25-gallon Kelvin. We use a number 3 char. That's about the only thing we give up. Uncle Boojies barrel. And then you would walk off with, in the bottles, you would leave with 25 gallons of White Dog. We'll probably give you about 20, an extra gallon or two, because you're going to lose a gallon, maybe gallon and a half to the wood the minute you put it in there. And so we think that would be a lot of fun for you to come in to, distill with us for the afternoon and the evening, and throw a big barbecue and everybody can have a lot of fun. We do a barrel burn, which is a lot of fun. And that way, instead of, you can age your own Uncle Boojies barrels back with your local groups.
Sounds outstanding.
That
All
sounds
right, who has a question for Steve?
First question: can we be in the pilot program of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things I want to talk to you guys about is, and I'll send it out. I'll work with you guys first. I'm working on all the pricing, and I'd like to be to see what the interest is. I mean, just to give you an idea, you know, uh, you know, you have to, just for a 300-gallon still in today's money with the proper building and all the other stuff, it's a $600,000 adventure, right? And so
Yeah.
you've got all this distilling capacity all over the state. And 4 or 5 years ago, nobody, the other problem is, if you go to the big guys, they want you to run 5,000 barrels, and we only want to do 200 barrels a year, right? And so they're not even going to talk to us. And so that's why the opportunity to work with Walter was so great at Whiskey Thief. But we're excited about this 25-gallon age your own barrel thing. It would get people into a barrel for, a fifth of the money that you would pay, if you went out and tried to buy a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old barrel.
Awesome. Who else has a question?
Yeah, I have one. With your rich heritage, am I coming through okay, Ben?
You are, I can hear
Yes, you are.
Good deal. With your rich heritage, Steve, have you tracked your lineage back to Ireland or Scotland? You have such with
Yeah,
Well,
actually, so if you're interested in that, this is a fascinating, you can look it up. So if I could find your 50th great grandfather, there's something called a Y-DNA test, and you would have the exact same, about 100, and I think it's 172 markers in your DNA sample. It would be an exact match to your 50th great grandfather. It's actually an extraordinary tool that people are using to trace all these ancestral lines. And so there was a group of researchers that paid the money, and we have traced the Howard lines. Very thin, it's very rare, but it goes all the way back to about 400, the year 400 in the Roman. We're on one side or the other of Hadrian's Wall, and so they think that the family came from the Baltic states to fight for the Roman Empire and stayed. Now, the way that normally works is there's some cute young little girl on the other side of the wall, and you're not interested in going back to where you came from, right? And so we definitely, the Howard family, survived in Scotland, and would have fought along Robert the Bruce in the battle, 1314, when became the first Scottish king. Uh, and so the Scotch-Irish immigration to America starts around 1705, 1710. And the way that happened, when we talk about Scotch-Irish, are Scottish folks who were pushed off their lands in Scotland because they were Presbyterians. And it was an extraordinary thing to do back then. Um, the Presbyterians were the first folks to say, we don't need to talk to God through the Pope or the King. We can talk to God through our Bible. And it's so hard to get people to understand, especially these young kids. I mean, people lived and died by their faith, right? I mean, it was their whole being. Um, and so the King of England basically gave you a choice when he created the Church of England, and he pushed all these folks off their lands in Scotland. You could either pledge God save the king, or you could, if you wanted to remain Presbyterian, they pushed you up to the Ulster plantation up in Northern Ireland. And that fight still goes on today. That was for those that are old enough, us that are old enough, the Catholics versus the Protestants in Northern Ireland and the IRA, that fight started 600 years ago, right? And so when these people came to America, they were called Scotch Irish. They were Scottish descent, but had lived in Ireland. And they estimate about 250,000 people came over between let's call it 1710 to 1770. And people claim that 80 to 90% of the population of the United States can trace back to some Scotch Irish heritage. Um, they were really the first people to call themselves Americans, and they weren't Virginians, they weren't Marylanders, they weren't they weren't the Quakers of Pennsylvania. They were quickly pushed to the Appalachian Mountains, because the English settlers wanted them as the buffer between the Native Americans and civilized society. And so what they have left us is the Appalachian culture, right? Gospel music, bluegrass music, Appalachian culture, food, and lots of myths, and like the black cat walking in front of you is an old Scotch Irish, taboo. And so the answer is yes. It's an extraordinary journey. And that's what's fascinating to me. And I say this at a lot of talks. The question really in my mind, I can go back personally to about 7 generations of folks who've risked their life so that we can sit here and have this conversation tonight. But if you think about it, the question really is, how did our families survive? I mean, wars, famines, massacres, disease, on and on and on. So through the millennia, the folks on this, on this call, what made them get up the next day and try again? And that's the fascinating story. And I think that's really the story of Uncle Boojies.
Love it. Who else has a question?
So I'll ask you some questions. The thing I've got is, since you won't tell us your mash bill or anything like this, since we'll end up at fish food. Um, other question I normally like to ask is, what's your favorite barrel, and what do you think the barrel influence does to the whiskey as you're making it and storing or aging it over time?
Well, we're using a Kelvin barrel. I definitely think the quality of the barrel is important, right? And the quality of the wood. Um, what's fascinating is you come on the floor right now, and they're, 8 barrels. They've all lived the same life, for the past 8 years, all within 50 feet of each other in the rick house. And you taste all 8 of them, and they're all completely different. So, that is one thing that, the bonded warehouse in Boojie's is, every bottle is a unique expression, because the barrel tastes that way on that day. The proof is that way. The proof doesn't move a lot, but it does move some, over 6, 7, 8 months. Maybe a barrel lasts 3 or 4 or 5 months on the floor for us. And so I invite you to come down and taste the different barrels, and you tell me, right? I mean, it is fascinating to me. Same barrel, same production, same age, all lived a similar life, and they taste completely different.
That's the one thing about Kelvin barrels I think is really interesting, is they use a wood fire to do it. They don't use the
Yeah.
propane like some of the bigger ones do. and it gives it a little more character. Granted, they have a recipe on how long a char 3, a char 4, char 2, whatever
Right.
it would be, but the characteristic of how hot was that fire that day, or how well that fire was built. And the characteristics that goes into that barrel gives that whiskey the characteristics. That's why, like you said, everyone's a single barrel, and they're
Yeah.
in every single one.
Well, and we, the one thing we do share is we use a number 3 char because we're looking for quick flavor and lots of depth, right? But or quick, I'm looking for quick color. I'm trying to get my color as fast as I can. And we're also finding with this new recipe, it's got this tweak that's activating the yeast like nobody's ever seen at Whiskey Thief. And we're getting dark color faster, and nobody can tell me why.
Wow.
So
Well, that
I
leads
mean,
into another question there. You're using the same yeast string from the old days, or is this a
no, we're using Whiskey Thieves. I wasn't that
Okay.
smart when I started. I mean, guys, I am not a bourbon, I'm a storyteller and
you do a
you
great
know,
job?
Ross is the reason I got great whiskey. Okay. And
Okay.
and then Walter after that, right? And so I am not a distiller. I'm not an expert in whiskey. I mean, I could tell you what tastes like shit and what tastes great. And I think our stuff tastes great. And I think there's a lot of shit out there that tastes like shit, right? And so,
We agree on that.
and we do this tasting thing on the floor that the ladies that work there have created, and it drives me crazy because I don't like, I always say if you need a handlebar mustache and an ascot to talk about how great your whiskey is, we got a problem. Okay.
Oh,
and
no
so
ascots in this group, buddy.
yeah.
No.
and so they've come up with all this, they call it a sensory tour, and you smell this and you do this, and I'm like, I think it's a bunch of hoo hockey, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so suggestive because if I say, well, I taste the blackberry in that, everybody's going to go, yeah, 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 right? I mean, that I want you to taste and buy and bottle what you want and what you like, right? It is a very, if you've been a Whiskey Thief, Walter does almost similar thing, and but yeah, it is we're looking for that unique proposition of what does that barrel taste like today in your glass, and whether you like it or not. That's the only value that's how we differentiate ourselves.
Hey,
I think
Steve,
that's amazing.
OG member Ryan Hallberg, been with us for a long time, great guy. He wants to know if you were trying Uncle Boojies for the first time, which bottle do you recommend they start with and why?
Well, I'd really like you to come visit me, right? Because I don't like making that choice for you. I will tell you the double oaked on the floor. I think I may get this wrong. I think it's about 125 proof right now, and it's extraordinary. And so we're double barreling. A lot of people will stave up their double oak for a while. 2 Kelvin barrels is a lot of money, but we definitely think it's worth the time and the effort. And I think that is 9 years old right now, and I think it's spectacular.
And I'll double down on that, and I'll say, hey, Ryan Hallberg, if you want to drive to Fort Wayne, I'll drive the rest of the way. Let's go.
Yeah, that's what I'd love for you guys to do, is find a friend, and and we can send some small samples up or whatever. But
I'll be there and join you, Ben.
Hey, if you get to Fort Wayne, I'm leaving.
Oh, I can get to Fort Wayne.
I'm
Don't
going to go
worry
to the
about
event, and then I'm going to drive back up. So you are welcome to ride along. I've got a Yukon.
How much is your double oak barrel or bottle?
It's so everything is uncut, unfiltered, thieved, and we're charging $145 for that.
Okay, thank you.
And I've only I only made 10 of those barrels, right? So everything is very limited production. And again, my goal is 200 barrels a year, guys. I'm not, I maybe my kids will screw this up, but right now, I think it's important that folks come sit with us, sit around the fire, have a cocktail, and we break bread together. That's what I'm after.
Your double oaked is the killer.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions as we wrap this up with Steve Smith from Uncle Boojies?
Thank you, Steve. Well presented.
Absolutely.
Well, we appreciate everybody, and please tell all your friends to visit us, and I hope that you'll bring the story of your families, and if I hope I've done one thing, and I would like to leave you with this. One of the things I've got 3 daughters, and as my mother, got sick, all these kids have these phones, and the last summer of her life, I made them go over and sit with her and get her to tell them the story of her life, right? The songs that she sang when she was a little kid, the creek she played in, the flower sack dresses she wore, all these little details. And I will tell you, they're the most valuable possessions my children have. And they cherish those. One of my daughters says she listens to grandmother once a week, right? And that's that's one of the things that I'll challenge everybody to do is go find the stories of your family and come sit with us, and we want to hear them.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your
Great.
time. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And go get your tickets tonight so that we can get them a final count on who all will be at Uncle Boojies this Saturday. It is going to be a big, great time. So make sure you don't miss out.